We have another pair of young women who are students here at Meredith that will give us our next talk, Holly Mills and Paula Meredith. Both of them are in the food and nutrition discipline. Paula is interested in going to graduate school, and she is very much interested in changing the way that we produce, distribute, and consume food. Holly is also interested in the food area, but in terms of justice as well as sustainable food systems. Paula lived in Italy and Mexico, and she has seen different lifestyles and the way that other cultures consume and distribute foods, and hopes to be able to help with the changes in the United States as well. So we want to welcome Holly.
Good morning. We're here to talk to you all about one thing that connects all of us, and that's food.
Consider what you've eaten in the last 24 hours. Perhaps you ate cereal purchased at a grocery store or eggs bought at a local farmer's market. While these locations may be comfortable and familiar for you, how much do you know about where your food was grown? Did you consider your environmental, economic, as well as community impacts your breakfast choices? If you're like many people, some of these questions may feel a bit unsettling.
Please keep in mind that this is a very complex topic, and today we simply want to provide you a glimpse of some of the conflicting, unsustainable situations that are prevalent in our current food system. The production, distribution, and consumption of our food supply are dependent on the environment, economy, and education. It is an interdependent system that evolves both ways, hence the double-sided arrows in this diagram. This system is fueled by the lack of knowledge that we, the common consumer, have of its inner workings. Even though we have the ability to obtain and consume the food that we have access to, do we truly know what that food is doing to our health as well as the environment? Let's begin discussing where the majority of the food that our nation produces originates. There are massive fields within our nation that tend to be a single type of crop, which is a monoculture. And these monocultures are affiliated with big agriculture. Even though these crops have high yields, they provide little nutrients and are subsidized by the government. Subsidies are set in place to assist food producers to expand production while keeping the cost of their products cheap. The major cash crops of the U.S. today are corn, wheat, cotton, and soy. The downside of producing mass amounts of monocultures leads to soil decomposition, an increase of pest resistance, and high rates of disease that has the potential to damage crops. Corn and wheat are the main ingredients in a lot of the non-perishable foods that we find in the grocery store. And these have produced a market of easy, accessible, cheap processed foods that are high in calories, fat, and sugar, which potentially lead to diet-related ailments.
Such heavily processed, nutrient-deficient food is an arguably acceptable choice for an occasional indulgence. Yet, across America, there is an unspoken phenomenon affecting the diets of millions of people daily. A food desert is a district with little to no access to a grocery store that can provide the fresh and easily accessible, affordable food that the average person needs to sustain a healthy diet. In food deserts, families and individuals are forced to choose between fast food restaurants and convenience stores to feed their family. Unfortunately, many of the people who tend to inhabit food deserts tend to be lower-income individuals who we just heard often require government assistance to feed their family. This means that they pick the most affordable option to feed themselves, in which case we often end up with processed, unhealthy food. Within the 50 United States, there are 6,500 food deserts. Within 2010 alone, that meant within Wake County, there were 47,000 children who didn't have access to what we would call real food.
The inability for Americans to afford or even have access to fresh, healthy foods has led our nation to develop unhealthy habits. As illustrated here from 1991 to 2010, obesity has become a nationwide epidemic. Obesity has the potential to develop various dietary ailments that are plaguing our healthcare system that we as taxpayers contribute to. The main victims of our current food system are the youth of our nation. As they continue to grow heavier more and more each year, they are being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and are expected to have a shorter lifespan than their own parents. If all citizens in this country had access to affordable, fresh, healthy food, we would decrease the amount of people suffering from hunger and would improve the health of our nation. Now, we have been discussing a lot about how our current food system affects us, but we, the consumer, are not the only ones suffering from the way our food is being produced. Animals in the environment are being sacrificed to provide us the nutrients to sustain life. Animals are grown in concentrated animal feeding operations, commonly known as CAFOs. Let's take a minute and imagine this auditorium as a CAFO. We could unnaturally be packed to mass capacity in here, where we wouldn't be exposed to natural light. You'll never be able to breathe fresh air. You won't know the feeling of grass underneath your feet, and you wouldn't be able to eat your preferred diet. Our nation is currently obsessed with consuming protein. The macronutrient is commonly obtained by consuming byproducts of animals and their meat, from chickens, cows, pigs, and let's not forget fish. We utilize chicken for both their eggs and their meat. Laying hens, illustrated in the top left corner, are packed 5 to 7 in a cage, and they are in such close proximity of each other, they can't even flap their wings. Their whole lives are spent eating from a small trough they can access by sticking their heads out between bars, while laying an egg every 2 days. Chickens that we harvest for meat are called fryers, and they're illustrated in the lower right corner. They are grown to market weight in these enclosed structures so tightly that as chicks, their beaks are clipped to prevent injury while they eat.
Likewise, there are 2 types of cows produced to fill consumer needs within our nation. Bulls, seen in the upper right corner, are kept within large fenced areas, yet there are thousands of cows to this small area. They must live, eat, and sleep in their own waste, with no room to graze on the non-existent grass, for the ground beneath them stays consistently trampled, and they have no room to move, much less exercise. With no picturesque milkmaids in sight, dairy cows in America, seen in the lower left corner, find themselves in factory-like assembly lines for milking. They remain pregnant through artificial insemination their entire mature lives to ensure productive, profitable milk production. Now, while any female in the room can attest to how unnatural and uncomfortable that would be, the fact remains that the average healthy heifer, her reproductive system simply cannot support those kinds of expectations. And yet, this is the kind of system from which most of us, albeit unknowingly, get our dairy products.
Fish, pictured in the lower middle photo, have been marketed to be included in our diet regularly to increase the consumption of healthy fatty acids omega-3 and 6. Therefore, the food industry has taken the opportunity to confine the fish in their own natural habitat to ensure a bigger product that will meet consumer demand.
Finally, we can see pigs kept in a closed CAFO in the upper center. These herds of thousands are never allowed outside for fear that this many pigs in one space would decimate the ground. So while monoculture can rob the soil of the essential nutrients to grow crops, the soil quality of outside of the CAFOs is heavily protected in order to ensure that the consumer gets the best quality product, while little concern is given to the effects on humans from eating pork kept in conditions such as these.
Within these CAFOs, animals are exposed to unsanitary conditions, leading to a wide use of antibiotics to treat illness and disease, which has recently become a concern among consumers. Whether or not you're a vegetarian or may consider eating meat a natural way of life, these industrialized practices have broad environmental and health consequences.
In addition to the costs to animal welfare, mass production of vegetation crops have led to the usage of poisonous pesticides and herbicides to ensure top yield. These toxic chemicals are applied mechanically through aviated dispersal, as well as through direct spray, in order to prevent pests and weeds from affecting the profit. Now, my food typically is labeled with pictures of happy farmers and animals in wide open spaces and flowing fields in the background. I don't often see pictures of CAFOs or the migrant farm worker whose job includes spraying this cancerous concoction of chemicals onto crops that we later consume. Last time I went to the grocery store, I didn't hear the story of how that worker brought home those chemicals on his clothes, while a mother at the neighboring register brought them home in a plastic bag for her family's meal. When providing for a community's needs stays within the limits of the community, the necessity for such extreme chemicals and extensive travel is lessened. From farm to plate, most conventionally produced food travels on average 2,000 miles. Now, if you don't live in a food desert, you're privileged enough to drive 5, maybe 10 miles to get your next meal. But have you considered how far your food had to come to get to you? Each year, 817 million tons of food are shipped around the planet. This process quadruples the amount of emissions created by the consumer demand for food. Corporate grocery stores must then offset the cost of the expensive 2-week-long delivery process, the water, soil, and heat required to grow the crop, the fertilizers and herbicides necessary to ensure their success, as well as the typical costs of running a business. With overhead costs so high, it's understandable how the environmental impacts of our current food system are considered collateral damage, perhaps for survival. But there must be a simpler way to do things. We haven't always survived this way. In North Carolina, we have incredibly fertile soil that can grow crops that can sustain my family and perhaps yours. Tentatively, our national food system suffices a status quo 3 times the size of America's current population. That excess food, already paid for by taxpayers through government subsidies, then sits to rot in a landfill. Meanwhile, 47,000 kids in Wake County sit munching on Cheetos and pizza.
As we have illustrated, in order to produce the food we eat puts an extreme toll on our planet as well as our waistlines. Yet we tend to be gluttonous in our consumption behavior. Currently, 40% of the food produced in this nation ends up in the trash. That's more than 20 pounds per person per month. Why do we waste so much food when there are so many of us out there that don't even have access to that? Is it because consumers tend to be influenced by sales and big wholesale clubs that leads us to buy more food that we can possibly eat before it spoils? Or is it that we utilize the sell-by date on products as a definite date of when that product is good or bad, when in reality, that date is used by the industry as a gauge of how long that product is allowed to stay on the grocery store shelf to meet its highest quality standard? Not to mention all the perfectly nutritious produce that is left in the fields to rot or thrown away at the grocery store because it won't match consumers' obsession of cosmetic perfection.
You can become a conscious consumer today by educating yourselves. We believe education is a crucial and necessary part of a sustainable food solution. What can you do to learn more about where your food came from? With whom could you share that information? How will that information impact your choices today about food and your future food choices? We believe the answers to these questions could be monumental. We understand that living a valued lifestyle is not always the most convenient or inexpensive option. We, after all, are broke college students with empty pockets and full hearts. If there's anything I've learned in school thus far, it's that you can't always buy or do everything. So what can you do today reasonably? It's easy to think in a math system such as ours that small changes to your life might not make an impact. That kind of thinking undermines your power as an individual within a larger community. A wise man recently told me that we change the world every day with the choices that we make. Whether you choose to see it that way or not, your actions do impact the world around you. So what choices could you consciously make for your world today? For a world that we share? For a world we borrow from the next generation? Where do you fit in the problem-solving puzzle? You are an important piece. So start finding your role in our food system today. Thank you.